The confession came on a Tuesday at exactly 7:43 in the evening. I know because I was staring at the oven timer, waiting for the rosemary chicken to finish roasting when Derek walked through the door of our Seattle penthouse with an expression I'd never seen before. Not guilt exactly, more like exhaustion mixed with something that looked almost like relief. He didn't even take off his coat before the words tumbled out. "I'm sleeping with Vanessa. It's been going on for 8 months. I think I might be in love with her." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The timer went off behind me, its shrill beep filling the silence that followed his confession. I remember thinking how absurd it was that my first instinct was to turn off that alarm, to rescue a dinner that suddenly meant nothing. My hands moved on autopilot, pulling the perfectly bronzed chicken from the oven while my husband stood in our marble-floored kitchen telling me he'd been carrying on an affair with his boss, the woman whose name had peppered our dinner conversations for the past year. "Vanessa thinks we should expand into the Portland market. Vanessa approved my proposal. Vanessa wants me to lead the new development team." I set the roasting pan down and finally turned to look at him fully. Derek was 36 but looked older in that moment, the overhead lighting harsh against the new lines around his eyes. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled in a way that now seemed deliberate, as if he'd been working up the courage for this conversation all day. When I didn't immediately scream or cry or throw something, confusion flickered across his face. He'd prepared for hysteria, I realized. He wanted the dramatic confrontation that would let him paint me as the unreasonable one, the emotional wife who couldn't handle difficult truths. Instead, I asked the most mundane question I could formulate. "Does she know you're telling me this?" His shoulders sagged slightly. "We decided together. It's not fair to anyone to keep pretending. Vanessa wants to be open about our relationship, and I owe you honesty at the very least." The clinical language struck me as rehearsed, as if they'd workshopped this conversation together, polishing the phrases until they sounded almost compassionate. "I owe you honesty." As if honesty after 8 months of deception was some generous gift rather than the absolute minimum. The first 3 days after Derek's confession passed in a strange fog where everything felt simultaneously hyperreal and completely detached from my body. He'd offered to sleep in the guest room, a gesture that might have seemed considerate if it didn't reek of eagerness to establish separate spaces. I told him not to bother. The bed was large enough that we could occupy it like strangers in a hotel, maintaining our respective territories without acknowledgement or contact. He seemed relieved by this arrangement, which told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly our marriage had already ended before his confession made it official. Wednesday morning arrived with Seattle's typical gray drizzle, the kind of weather that made the city feel like it existed under a wet wool blanket. Derek left early for work, mumbling something about a site inspection, and I sat at our dining table with my laptop open to job listings I couldn't focus on. My marketing consultant career had been thriving before I'd agreed to take a step back 2 years ago when Derek's position at Hartford Development Group demanded more of his attention. The plan had been temporary, just until his project launched and stabilized. Vanessa had specifically requested him for a high-profile mixed-use development in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, and the opportunity seemed too significant to pass up. "How supportive of you," my sister Tessa had said when I'd explained my decision to reduce my client load. Her tone had been neutral but her eyes skeptical. "Just make sure you're not making yourself smaller so he can expand." I'd laughed off her concern then, secure in the narrative I'd constructed about partnership and mutual support. Now her words echoed with prophetic weight as I scrolled through marketing positions that felt like step backwards from where my career had been headed. My phone buzzed with a text from Imani, my former roommate from University of Washington who'd relocated to Austin 5 years ago to work for a tech startup. The message was brief and characteristic of her direct communication style. "Tessa told me. I have a spare room and a job lead if you want to burn it all down and start fresh. No judgment either way, but the offer stands." I stared at the message for a long time, my coffee growing cold in its hand-thrown ceramic mug, another artifact of the life Derek and I had carefully curated together. Our penthouse was full of such objects, each one selected to project a specific image of sophisticated urban professionals who valued craft and quality. The mug had cost $45 from a local artisan whose studio we'd visited on a date 3 years ago, back when we still had dates that didn't revolve around his work obligations or networking events with his colleagues. The idea of leaving Seattle felt both impossible and inevitable. This city had been my home for 12 years, since I'd arrived as a nervous 22-year-old graduate student with dreams of building a career in brand strategy. I'd worked crushing hours at agencies that treated junior employees as expendable, slowly building a reputation and client base that eventually allowed me to go independent. The penthouse, the carefully cultivated professional network, the favorite coffee shops and running routes along the waterfront, all of it was woven into my identity in ways that felt fundamental. But sitting in that expensive apartment with its view of Elliott Bay obscured by rain, I realized how much of that identity had been constructed around being Derek's wife. The networking events where I'd smiled and made small talk with his colleagues while he worked the room. The dinner parties where I'd perfected the role of gracious hostess, ensuring everyone's glass stayed full and conversation flowed smoothly. The charity galas where my job was to look polished and supportive while he schmoozed potential investors. When had I last attended an event for my own professional advancement rather than his? Derek came home late that evening, his coat damp from the rain and smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. He didn't apologize for the lateness or explain where he'd been, and I didn't ask. We moved around each other in the kitchen like dance partners who'd forgotten the choreography, each of us pretending the other wasn't there while assembling separate meals. He made a protein shake. I heated leftover soup. We ate in different rooms. Thursday brought the first concrete consequence of his confession when an email arrived from Graham Wells, Derek's closest friend and colleague at Hartford Development. The subject line read simply, "We should talk," and the message itself was brief. "Natalie, I feel caught in the middle of something I never wanted to be part of. I value your friendship and hate that this situation makes things so complicated. Can we grab coffee?" Graham had always been kind to me, the sort of person who remembered details from previous conversations and asked thoughtful follow-up questions. His discomfort radiated through even the careful neutrality of his email. I deleted the message without responding. Graham's loyalty was to Derek, as it should be. They'd been friends since college, had been hired at Hartford Development within months of each other, had celebrated promotions and commiserated over setbacks together. My friendship with Graham had always been a secondary relationship, contingent on my marriage to Derek. Now that the marriage was dissolving, I had no interest in forcing people to choose sides or navigate the awkward territory of maintaining connections to both parties in a separation. The practical realities of divorce began asserting themselves with increasing urgency. Our penthouse was a rental, the lease in both our names with 6 months remaining. My reduced client load meant my income had dropped to roughly a third of what it had been at its peak, while Derek's salary and bonuses had climbed steadily upward. We had a joint checking account, joint credit cards, shared subscriptions to everything from streaming services to the gym membership I rarely used anymore. Untangling a decade of financial enmeshment would require lawyers and paperwork and difficult conversations about asset division. Or I could simply walk away from all of it. The thought arrived fully formed, radical in its simplicity. What if I didn't fight for my share of the furniture and kitchen equipment and carefully accumulated possessions? What if I just took what mattered and left the rest behind like artifacts of someone else's life? The penthouse had been Derek's find, the furniture largely selected by an interior designer he'd insisted we hire. My actual contributions to our shared space were minimal, concentrated mostly in my home office where I'd maintained some semblance of my own aesthetic preferences. Friday evening I made my decision while Derek was out at what he claimed was a work dinner but was almost certainly a date with Vanessa. I booked a one-way flight to Austin departing Monday morning, then sent a brief email to my 3 remaining clients explaining that personal circumstances required me to relocate and I'd be transitioning their accounts to a trusted colleague. The colleague in question, Marcus Chin, had been trying to poach my clients for years but was competent enough that I trusted him not to damage the relationships I'd built. Then I replied to Imani's text with equal brevity. "I'm coming. Monday. I'll explain everything when I get there." Her response arrived within minutes. "The spare room is yours as long as you need it. Austin's weird but it's good weird. You'll fit right in." The weekend passed in a strange suspension where Derek and I continued our parallel existence, intersecting only in practical matters like who would use the bathroom first or whether we needed to restock the coffee supply. He didn't ask about my sudden productivity, the way I'd begun sorting through my belongings and packing items into boxes labeled for donation. Perhaps he assumed I was simply organizing, engaging in the kind of nesting behavior that sometimes accompanies stress. Or perhaps he didn't notice at all, too absorbed in whatever future he was building with Vanessa to pay attention to what his soon-to-be ex-wife was doing. Sunday afternoon I finally told him I was leaving. We were in the living room, occupying opposite ends of the sectional sofa while rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was scrolling through his phone, probably texting with Vanessa. I was reading a book I wasn't actually absorbing, the words blurring together into meaningless shapes. "I'm moving to Austin," I said without preamble. "My flight leaves tomorrow morning. You can have the apartment and everything in it. I'll send you my forwarding address once I'm settled, and we can work out the divorce details through lawyers." His head snapped up, genuine surprise breaking through his careful neutrality. "Austin? Tomorrow? That seems incredibly impulsive." His tone carried a note of concern that might have been touching if it wasn't so transparently self-serving. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He didn't want me to leave because he cared about my well-being. He wanted me to stay so the dissolution of our marriage could proceed on his timeline, at his convenience, without disrupting the narrative he'd constructed about an amicable separation between two mature adults. "There's nothing keeping me here," I replied evenly. "You've made that abundantly clear. My career is portable, I have a place to stay, and frankly I can't stomach another day of pretending this situation is sustainable. You want to be with Vanessa, so be with her. I'm not going to stick around and watch." He set his phone down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees in the posture that usually preceded his reasonable discussion voice. "Natalie, I know this is painful, but running away to another state isn't going to solve anything. We need to have difficult conversations about property division and financial arrangements. We should probably consider couples counseling to process this in a healthy way." The absurdity of his suggestion nearly made me laugh. Couples counseling for a relationship where one partner had been sleeping with his boss for 8 months? Processing in a healthy way after he'd already decided he was in love with someone else? The suggestion was insulting in its transparency, a delaying tactic designed to keep me engaged and available while he solidified his relationship with Vanessa without the messiness of an angry ex-wife complicating things. "I don't need counseling to process your betrayal," I said quietly. "I need distance and a fresh start. You can email me about the practical details. I'm sure we can handle the divorce paperwork without requiring face-to-face meetings. The apartment lease is up in 6 months. I'll sign whatever you need me to sign to remove my name early if you want to stay here with her." His expression shifted then, frustration breaking through the careful compassion. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're being vindictive and dramatic instead of approaching this like an adult. We built a life together, Natalie. That deserves more respect than you just vanishing in the middle of the night." The words hit like a physical blow, revealing how thoroughly he'd rewritten our history. In his version, I was the problem, the emotional one who couldn't handle difficult truths with appropriate maturity. My decision to leave rather than participate in his preferred separation timeline was vindictive rather than self-preserving. The life we'd built together, the one where I'd systematically made myself smaller to accommodate his expanding career, deserved respect that apparently my feelings didn't. I stood up, carefully marking my page in the book I'd been pretending to read. "I'm leaving tomorrow morning at 6. My flight is at 8:30, so I'll be gone before you wake up. You can keep everything except what I've already packed. Consider it a gift for 10 years of my life spent supporting your ambitions while mine gathered dust." I walked to my home office and closed the door before he could respond, my heart hammering in my chest with an adrenaline that felt electric and clarifying. Through the door I heard him moving around the living room, then the sound of the front door opening and closing as he left the apartment. Going to Vanessa's, probably, to complain about his unreasonable wife who couldn't handle his honesty with appropriate grace. The rest of Sunday evening I spent doing final preparations for my departure. I'd already arranged for a shipping company to collect 3 boxes of belongings I'd packed, mostly books and personal items that held actual sentimental value rather than the performative significance of our shared possessions. Everything else I was leaving behind, including the expensive wardrobe I'd accumulated for the endless networking events and charity galas that had consumed so much of my time over the past few years. My 2 large suitcases contained mostly practical clothing, my laptop and work files, and a few photographs from before my marriage when my life had still felt like it belonged to me. Looking at those pictures now, I barely recognized the 24-year-old woman grinning at the camera, her eyes bright with ambition and certainty about her future. That woman had believed she could build something meaningful, that her creativity and strategic thinking would carve out space in an industry that chewed up and spit out most people who tried to make it. What happened to her? When had I stopped being that person and become instead the polished accessory to Derek's ascending career? The transformation had been gradual enough that I'd never noticed the critical moment of surrender, the specific instance where I'd chosen his success over my own aspirations. Or maybe there had been no single moment but rather 1,000 small compromises that accumulated into the wholesale abandonment of my professional identity. I set my alarm for 4:30 Monday morning, wanting to be gone before Derek woke up and potentially tried to delay my departure with more reasonable discussions about handling our separation like adults. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by anxiety about the leap I was taking and a strange undercurrent of excitement that felt almost guilty. My marriage was ending. My career was in shambles. I was fleeing to a city where I knew exactly one person, with no job prospects and only enough savings to last a few months if I was careful. And yet some part of me felt more alive than I had in years, energized by the terrifying freedom of having nothing left to lose. Derek's confession had detonated my carefully constructed life, but in the rubble I was discovering that maybe I'd been suffocating under the weight of that construction all along. The version of myself I'd been performing for the past decade had been a poor fit, like wearing someone else's clothes and pretending they looked good despite the constant discomfort. My alarm went off in darkness, Monday morning arriving with the finality of a door closing. I dressed quickly in comfortable travel clothes, double-checked that I had my identification and boarding pass, and took one final look around the penthouse that had been my home for 3 years. In the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the windows, the space looked like a magazine spread, beautifully designed and utterly impersonal. Nothing about it reflected who I actually was or had been before I'd agreed to become Mrs. Derek Brennan, supportive wife to an ambitious executive. I left my keys on the kitchen counter along with a brief note explaining where I'd forwarded my mail and providing Imani's address for any necessary legal correspondence. Then I wheeled my suitcases out into the hallway and closed the door behind me for the last time, feeling the satisfying click of the lock engaging like punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. The Uber ride to Seattle-Tacoma Airport passed in a blur of dark streets and highway lights, the driver mercifully uninterested in conversation. I checked in mechanically, moved through security, found my gate and settled into an uncomfortable plastic chair to wait for boarding. My phone remained silent. Derek either hadn't woken up yet or had decided not to attempt any last-minute persuasion. Either way, the lack of contact felt like confirmation that I'd made the right choice. As passengers began lining up to board, I powered off my phone completely, wanting the flight to Austin to exist in a bubble separate from everything I was leaving behind. The woman in the window seat asked if I was visiting Austin or returning home, and I realized I didn't know how to answer that question. "I'm starting over," I finally said, and she nodded as if that made perfect sense, as if people reinvented their entire lives on a regular basis and my situation was completely ordinary. Maybe it was ordinary. Maybe countless people made similar leaps every day, walking away from situations that had become untenable and betting everything on the possibility of something better. The thought was both comforting and terrifying as the plane taxied toward the runway, Seattle falling away beneath us as we climbed into clouds that obscured everything below. I pressed my forehead against the cool window and watched my old life disappear, having no idea what was waiting for me in Austin but certain that whatever it was had to be better than the slow suffocation of the existence I just escaped. Imani met me at Austin Bergstrom International Airport holding a hand-lettered sign that read, "Fresh Start Express," despite knowing exactly what I looked like and being perfectly capable of spotting me in the arrivals area. Her grin was infectious as she pulled me into a hug that smelled like sandalwood and the faint tang of soldering flux, a combination that immediately reminded me of our college days when she'd been building circuit boards in our dorm room at 2 in the morning. "You look like hell," she said cheerfully, grabbing one of my suitcases. Which is actually kind of perfect because Austin specializes in transforming disasters into success stories. Come on, I'm parked in short term because I figured you'd want to get out of here fast. The drive from the airport into the city provided my first real glimpse of Austin's landscape, so fundamentally different from Seattle's water and mountains that it felt like arriving on another planet. The sky stretched vast and blue in a way that seemed almost aggressive after years of marine layer and cloud cover. Everything looked sun-bleached and sprawling, strip malls giving way to neighborhoods of small houses with chain-link fences and pickup trucks in driveways. So here's the situation, Imani said as we merged onto the highway. My place is in East Austin, which used to be sketchy but is now gentrifying at approximately the speed of light. You'll have the spare bedroom for as long as you need it, no pressure. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks away called the Grind Station where tech people basically live, and the owner is always complaining about needing better marketing. I already told her about you. I twisted in my seat to look at her. You told a coffee shop owner about me? When? I've been on a plane for 4 hours. Imani shrugged, changing lanes with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd adapted to Texas driving. I texted her yesterday after you confirmed your flight. Claudia's good people. She sold her first startup for something obscene back in the 90s, bought the coffee shop as a retirement project, got bored with retirement, and now she's basically running an unofficial incubator for every broke tech founder in the city. You two will either love each other or want to kill each other within 5 minutes. Either way, it'll be entertaining. Her apartment turned out to be the upper floor of a converted duplex painted an alarming shade of turquoise with purple trim. The stairs leading up to her entrance were external, metal, and rang with each step. Inside, the space was exactly what I'd expected from Imani, functional chaos with an underlying organizational system only she understood. Circuit boards and components covered one entire wall, her work-from-home setup for the hardware startup she'd joined 3 years ago. The furniture was an eclectic mix of thrift store finds and expensive ergonomic office equipment, and every horizontal surface held coffee mugs in various stages of abandonment. Home sweet home, she announced, depositing my suitcase in a small bedroom that held a double bed, a desk, and nothing else. I cleared out most of Sophia's stuff when she moved in with her girlfriend last month, so you've got a blank canvas. There's a Target about 10 minutes away if you need basics. She paused, her expression softening slightly. You want to talk about it, or you want to pretend everything's fine while you process? The question was so perfectly Imani, offering both options without judgment, that I felt tears threatening for the first time since Derek's confession. Later, I managed. Right now I just need to exist in a place where nothing reminds me of him. She nodded briskly. Then let's go meet Claudia. Fair warning, she's intense and has no concept of personal boundaries, but her coffee is legitimately the best in the city and she's weirdly good at seeing potential in people everyone else has written off. The Grind Station occupied a corner lot in what looked like a transitioning neighborhood, older houses being torn down and replaced with modern townhomes while other properties remained defiantly unchanged. The coffee shop itself had clearly once been something else, maybe a house or small office building, and retained an architectural quirkiness that chain establishments could never replicate. Through the large front windows I could see exposed brick walls, mismatched furniture, and what appeared to be a functional server rack in one corner. Claudia Reyes turned out to be a compact woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair cut in a severe bob and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd already sized you up and made decisions about your value before you'd finished introducing yourself. She wore jeans and a vintage band t-shirt under a cardigan that had seen better days, and her handshake was firm enough to be slightly uncomfortable. So you're the one who let her husband convince her to quit working, Claudia said without preamble, already pulling espresso shots with practiced efficiency. Imani filled me in. Question is whether you're going to spend the next 6 months feeling sorry for yourself or whether you're going to get angry and build something. The bluntness should have been off-putting but instead felt oddly refreshing after Derek's careful language and therapeutic framing. I don't know yet, I admitted. Right now I'm just trying to figure out how to pay rent next month. Claudia slid a perfectly crafted cappuccino across the counter toward me. Marketing consultant, yeah? Imani said you were good before you went domestic. The coffee shop doesn't need marketing help because word of mouth keeps me busier than I want to be. But I know about 40 founders in this neighborhood who are building interesting things with zero idea how to tell anyone about them. You interested in project work while you figure out your next move? I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, inhaling steam that smelled complex and dark. What kind of projects? Whatever needs doing. Brand positioning, content strategy, social media presence, pitch deck refinement. Most of these kids are brilliant engineers who think marketing is black magic. You'd be doing them a favor by charging half your old rates, and you'd be building a portfolio of startup work instead of the luxury brand stuff you were doing in Seattle. The assumption that I'd automatically be interested stung slightly, as if my desperation was so obvious that predatory pricing was the only option available. But underneath the irritation, something else stirred, genuine interest in the kind of work she was describing. My corporate clients in Seattle had been established brands with enormous budgets and risk-averse marketing teams. Working with startups would mean creative freedom in exchange for financial uncertainty, helping build something from nothing rather than maintaining carefully established prestige. I'll think about it, I said, which Claudia apparently interpreted as agreement because she immediately pulled out her phone and started texting. Good. There's a founder showcase Thursday night, bunch of early-stage companies pitching their concepts to a room full of other founders and some local investors. Come with me, meet people, see if any of them seem worth your time. She looked up from her phone, her expression sharpening. But first you need to decide whether you're running away from something or towards something, because that distinction matters. The question followed me back to Imani's apartment where I spent the rest of Monday unpacking my meager belongings and trying to establish some sense of normalcy in my displaced existence. Imani worked from her cluttered desk in the main living area, occasionally making cryptic comments into video calls about capacitor specifications and production timelines. I set up my laptop on the small desk in my borrowed bedroom and stared at the blank screen, trying to formulate a plan that extended beyond simple survival. My inbox contained exactly 3 messages of note. The first was from Marcus Chen confirming receipt of my client transitions and promising to maintain the relationships I'd built. The second was from Tessa asking if I'd landed safely and offering to wire money if I needed it, her worry evident even through text. The third was from Derek, sent at 9:17 that morning, brief and coldly professional. I've consulted with an attorney about uncontested divorce proceedings. Please confirm receipt of this email so I know you're checking this address. I archived his message without responding, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of my immediate attention. Let him wonder. Let him experience even a fraction of the uncertainty he'd inflicted on me with his confession. The pettiness of the impulse wasn't lost on me, but I allowed myself the indulgence anyway. Tuesday I forced myself into a routine that approximated productivity. Morning run through the unfamiliar neighborhood, trying to acclimate to heat that felt oppressive even at 7 in the morning. Shower. Coffee that Imani made in quantities that suggested she was permanently caffeinated. Then hours at my borrowed desk researching Austin's startup ecosystem, trying to understand the landscape Claudia had casually suggested I enter. What I discovered was both intimidating and energizing. Austin had positioned itself as a secondary tech hub, attracting founders priced out of Silicon Valley but unwilling to abandon innovation-focused careers. The city offered lower costs, aggressive business incentives, and a culture that seemed to value weird creativity over polished professionalism. Companies were building everything from agricultural technology to music streaming platforms to quantum computing applications, often working out of converted warehouses and co-working spaces that looked nothing like the gleaming corporate offices I associated with tech success. Wednesday afternoon Imani dragged me to a networking happy hour at a bar that served craft cocktails and artisanal pizza to a crowd that skewed young and casually dressed. I felt overdressed in the business casual outfit I'd selected, surrounded by people wearing startup t-shirts and expensive sneakers. Imani introduced me to a rotating cast of founders and engineers, each conversation following a similar pattern of friendly curiosity about my background followed by thinly veiled assessment of whether I might be useful to their ventures. One founder named Priya Kapoor lingered longer than the others, asking pointed questions about my experience with brand positioning for luxury markets. She was 29, whip-smart, and building something she described as sustainability analytics for small businesses, though the technical details largely went over my head. What I gathered was that her platform could theoretically help small companies track and reduce their environmental impact while saving money, but she had no idea how to explain this to potential customers in language that didn't require an engineering degree to parse. So basically you've built something valuable but you're terrible at communicating its value, I summarized after she'd spent 10 minutes explaining algorithmic efficiency metrics. Priya laughed, a sound of genuine amusement rather than polite deflection. That's exactly it. I can show you the code, I can demonstrate the functionality, but the second someone asks me to explain why they should care, I sound like I'm reading from a technical manual. My co-founder keeps saying we need to hire a marketing person but we're pre-revenue and bootstrapped, so that's not happening anytime soon. What if you didn't hire someone full-time, I suggested. What if you brought in a consultant who worked for equity plus a small retainer? Someone who could help you articulate your value proposition and build initial marketing infrastructure without requiring a full salary. Her eyes sharpened with interest. Are you offering? The question hung between us for a moment while I considered what I was actually proposing. Working for equity in an unproven startup was exactly the kind of risk Derek would have dismissed as foolish and impractical. But sitting in that crowded bar surrounded by people building things from nothing, I felt the first genuine spark of excitement about work that I'd experienced in years. Maybe, I said carefully. Let me see your pitch deck and current materials. If I think there's something worth building, we can talk terms. Priya pulled out her phone immediately, texting me links and documents with an urgency that suggested she'd been waiting for someone to show even passing interest in her marketing challenges. We exchanged contact information and agreed to meet at the grind station Friday morning to discuss potential collaboration. Thursday evening arrived with the founder's showcase Claudia had mentioned, held in a converted warehouse that now served as a co-working space. The venue was packed with people clutching craft beers and watching presentations projected onto a wall that still bore the faded painted logo of whatever manufacturing operation had originally occupied the building. Claudia materialized at my elbow as the first presenter took the makeshift stage, a nervous kid who couldn't have been older than 23 pitching an app for coordinating food truck locations. Watch how they communicate their ideas, Claudia murmured. Most of them will focus on features instead of benefits, on what they've built instead of what problems they solve. The ones who understand narrative are the ones who'll actually get funded and succeed. She was right. Presentation after presentation followed the same pattern, enthusiastic founders diving immediately into technical specifications and implementation details while glossing over the fundamental question of why anyone should care. A few stood out for their ability to tell compelling stories about the problems they were addressing, but most treated their pitches like technical demonstrations rather than persuasive communication. During the networking break between presentation sets, a man who looked to be in his mid-60s approached me with the kind of assessing gaze I was beginning to recognize as standard in this ecosystem. Leonard Voss, he introduced himself, extending a weathered hand. I've been watching you watch these pitches. You're making the face of someone who knows these founders are butchering their own stories. I laughed despite myself. Is it that obvious? Leonard smiled, lines crinkling around eyes that suggested he spent significant time outdoors. Only to someone who's looking for it. I sold my logistics company 15 years ago and now I mostly advise early-stage founders on operational scaling. Claudia mentioned she'd brought a refugee from Seattle who used to do brand work for luxury markets. I'm guessing that's you. Word travels fast apparently. He shrugged. Austin's tech community is surprisingly small once you account for the people who actually know what they're doing versus the kids playing startup. Claudia thinks you're hungry enough to do interesting work. She's usually right about these assessments. The casual way he discussed my situation should have felt invasive but instead came across as pragmatic acknowledgement of obvious reality. I am hungry, I admitted. Question is whether I'm hungry enough to bet on unproven ventures instead of pursuing stable client work. Leonard's expression turned thoughtful. Stable is a myth, especially in marketing. Your Seattle clients felt stable right up until they weren't. At least with startups you know the instability is part of the deal, and if you're smart about selecting which ones to work with, the upside potential is considerable. We talked through the second half of the showcase, Leonard offering sardonic commentary on each presentation while simultaneously explaining what the founders were doing right or catastrophically wrong. His analysis was sharp and unsentimental, the perspective of someone who'd built and sold successful companies and had no patience for the kind of wishful thinking that often passed for business strategy in startup culture. By the time the event concluded, I'd collected business cards from 7 founders interested in discussing marketing consultation, had been invited to 3 more networking events, and felt more professionally energized than I had in the entire previous year combined. The work would be unstable and potentially unprofitable, but it would be mine in a way that my previous corporate client work had never been. Friday morning I met Priya at the grind station as planned, claiming a corner table while Claudia worked her espresso machine with choreographed precision. Priya arrived with a battered laptop covered in stickers and an energy that suggested she'd already consumed significant caffeine before our meeting. "Okay," she said without preamble, pulling up files on her screen. "Be brutal. Tell me everything that's wrong with how we're presenting this." I spent the next 90 minutes dissecting her existing materials, which were as technically impressive as they were strategically incoherent. Her pitch deck buried the actual value proposition under layers of implementation details. Her website read like an academic paper. Her social media presence consisted primarily of engineering jokes that would only resonate with people who already understood her technology. "You're marketing to yourself," I finally said. "Everything here is designed to impress other engineers, but engineers aren't your target market. Small business owners are, and they don't care about your algorithmic efficiency. They care about saving money and feeling good about their environmental impact. You need to completely restructure your messaging around those emotional and practical benefits." Priya nodded slowly, absorbing the criticism without defensiveness. "Can you fix it?" "I can help you fix it," I corrected. "This is your company and your vision. I can provide strategic guidance and implementation support, but the core message has to come from you understanding your customers better than you currently do." We spent another hour negotiating terms, ultimately agreeing on a modest monthly retainer plus equity that would vest over 2 years assuming the company survived that long. The arrangement was risky for both of us but felt more honest than the corporate client relationships I'd maintained in Seattle, where enormous budgets had masked fundamental disconnection between the work I was doing and any measurable outcomes. Over the following 2 weeks, I threw myself into rebuilding my professional life from scratch. Mornings were dedicated to client work, starting with Priya's sustainability platform but quickly expanding to include 2 other early-stage companies Claudia had connected me with. Afternoons I spent networking, attending every startup event and founder gathering I could find, systematically building relationships in Austin's tech ecosystem. The work was grinding and uncertain, requiring me to operate without the safety net of established processes and reliable payment schedules. One founder's check bounced. Another decided to pivot their entire business model mid-project, rendering weeks of marketing work obsolete. But underneath the chaos, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: genuine engagement with creative challenges that required my full attention and strategic thinking. Imani watched my transformation with amused approval, occasionally offering unsolicited advice about which founders seemed legitimate versus which were engaged in what she called startup cosplay. Her ability to assess technical feasibility proved invaluable as I evaluated potential clients, helping me avoid ventures that were fundamentally unworkable regardless of how compelling their marketing might become. 3 weeks into my Austin existence, Derek finally called. I was at the grind station working on website copy when my phone buzzed with his name. For a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity won out. His voice sounded strained when I accepted the call. "You've been ignoring my emails about the divorce paperwork." "I've been busy building a new life," I replied evenly. "What do you need?" A pause, then careful words that sounded rehearsed. "I wanted to check that you're okay. Tessa mentioned you're in Austin working with startups, which seems like a significant career pivot. I just want to make sure you're making rational decisions rather than reactive ones." The presumption that my choices required his validation sparked immediate anger. "My decisions are mine to make now, Derek. That's what happens when you blow up a marriage. You lose the right to weigh in on your ex-wife's career trajectory." "I'm trying to be supportive," he said, frustration creeping into his tone. "But disappearing to another state and gambling on unstable startup work instead of leveraging your established client relationships seems self-destructive." "Or maybe it seems like freedom," I countered. "Maybe I'm finally doing work that interests me instead of maintaining corporate brands that bore me senseless. Maybe I'm building something that belongs to me instead of supporting your networking agenda." The silence that followed felt heavy with all the conversations we'd never had during our marriage, all the resentments I'd swallowed to maintain the appearance of supportive partnership. When he finally spoke again, his voice had shifted into the cold professional tone I associated with his business negotiations. Fine. Be reckless. But when this startup fantasy collapses and you need actual income, don't expect me to bail you out. Sign the divorce papers I sent and let's finish this cleanly. He disconnected before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone in the noisy coffee shop while Claudia watched from behind her espresso machine with knowing eyes. She walked over once I'd set the phone down, sliding a fresh cappuccino across my table without comment. Ex-husband? She asked. I nodded, taking a long sip of coffee that tasted like comfort and competence. He thinks I'm being reckless and self-destructive. Claudia's smile was sharp. Good. The best revenge is becoming someone they didn't think you were capable of being. Now stop letting him live in your head rent-free and finish that website copy. Priya's counting on you. The website launched on a Thursday 6 weeks after my arrival in Austin, and Priya's reaction was worth every hour of revision and strategic refinement we'd invested. She called me at 7 in the morning, her voice pitched high with excitement that cut through my groggy confusion about why anyone would be awake at such an hour. We got our first 3 paid customers overnight, she said without greeting. 3 actual businesses signed up for annual subscriptions based purely on the website messaging. Natalie, this is working. This is actually working. I sat up in bed, my borrowed room still dim in the early light filtering through cheap blinds. That's incredible. Did they find you through search or social? 2 from the content marketing blog posts you set up, 1 from the LinkedIn campaign. She paused, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I know we agreed on equity compensation, but I'm adding a performance bonus to this month's retainer. You've earned it. After we disconnected, I lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling with a satisfaction that felt both earned and slightly surreal. 6 weeks ago I'd been fleeing Seattle with no plan beyond escape. Now I was generating measurable results for a client who valued my contribution enough to exceed our agreed compensation. The trajectory felt impossibly steep, as if I'd compressed years of career rebuilding into a compressed timeline driven by desperation and stubborn determination to prove Derek's dismissiveness wrong. Imani was already awake when I emerged from my room, working at her standing desk with multiple monitors displaying code I couldn't begin to decipher. She glanced over as I entered, assessing my expression with the practiced ease of someone who'd known me through college breakups and career setbacks. You look less terrified than usual, she observed. Something good happen? I told her about Priya's early customers while making coffee in the French press Imani preferred over more conventional brewing methods. She listened while debugging something on her center screen, occasionally making small noises of approval. So you're officially not a disaster, she concluded when I finished. Which means it's probably time to talk about what you're actually building here beyond client work that pays your immediate bills. The question landed with more weight than her casual tone suggested. What do you mean? Imani swiveled in her chair to face me fully. You're doing good work for Priya and the other founders Claudia connected you with. But you're operating as a solo consultant trading time for money, which has a ceiling built in. At some point you run out of hours to sell. The question is whether you want to stay at that level or whether you want to build something scalable. I'd been so focused on immediate survival and proving my professional viability that I hadn't considered the larger strategic question she was posing. Build something scalable like what? She shrugged. That's for you to figure out. But I've watched you work with these startup founders for 6 weeks now, and you have a pattern. You're not just doing marketing tasks. You're teaching them how to think about storytelling and positioning in ways that fundamentally change how they approach their entire business strategy. That's valuable, and it's replicable. Her observation rattled around in my head for the rest of that day as I worked through my client tasks. She was right that my engagements had evolved beyond tactical execution. With Priya, I'd essentially rebuilt her entire go-to-market strategy from the ground up. With the other 2 companies I was advising, similar patterns had emerged where my initial scope had expanded into broader strategic consulting about product positioning and customer communication. That evening I attended another networking event, this one at a rooftop bar overlooking downtown Austin's modest skyline. The crowd skewed slightly older than the previous gatherings I'd attended, more established founders and investors rather than fresh graduates playing at entrepreneurship. Leonard Voss was there, holding court near the bar with several people who listened with the attentiveness that suggested he was dispensing valuable wisdom. He spotted me and waved me over, making space in the conversation circle. We were just discussing the gap in the market for strategic support aimed at technical founders, he said by way of introduction. Most marketing consultants either come from agency backgrounds and don't understand product, or they're former founders themselves but charge rates that early-stage companies can't afford. There's an opportunity in the middle. One of the other investors, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia who ran a seed-stage fund, nodded agreement. I see brilliant teams all the time who are building genuinely innovative solutions but can't articulate their value proposition to save their lives. The ones who figure out messaging early have a massive advantage, but most founders treat marketing as an afterthought until they're desperate for customers. The conversation continued around me while I absorbed the validation of what Imani had suggested that morning. There was a genuine need in the market for the specific kind of strategic support I'd been providing, positioned at the intersection of marketing execution and broader business strategy. The question was whether I had the courage to build something systematic around that need rather than continuing to operate as an independent consultant taking whatever projects came my way. Marcus Chin called me the following Monday with an unexpected proposition. One of my former Seattle clients, a sustainable fashion brand called Verdant, had reached out asking if I might be available for a project. They were launching a new product line and remembered my work fondly enough to inquire about my availability despite my relocation. The fee they're offering is substantial, Marcus said carefully. 3 months of work at your old rates, probably 40 hours a week. I told them I'd pass along the inquiry but that your focus had shifted to startup consulting. Wanted to check with you before I declined on your behalf. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, staring out Imani's living room window at the neighbor's yard where someone had planted a vegetable garden that was thriving in the Texas heat. The money Marcus was describing would solve my immediate financial uncertainty for months. It would validate that my previous career still had value, that I could return to that world if I chose. It would also mean setting aside the momentum I'd been building in Austin, likely losing the startup clients who depended on my consistent availability. Tell them I appreciate the offer but I'm not available, I finally said. My focus is here now. Marcus made a thoughtful sound. You're sure? This is guaranteed money versus the uncertainty of startup work. I'm sure. The work I'm doing now matters in ways the corporate projects never did. I'd rather build something meaningful than return to work that pays well but leaves me feeling empty. After we disconnected, I sat with the weight of that decision, recognizing it as a definitive turning point. I'd actively chosen uncertainty and purpose over security and boredom, betting on my ability to create something valuable rather than retreating to the comfortable familiarity of corporate marketing. The choice felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, as if I'd stepped off a cliff and discovered I could fly. Claudia called that same afternoon with her own proposition, delivered with characteristic bluntness. I'm putting together a founder boot camp for technical people who need help with business fundamentals. 8 weeks, cohort-based, meeting twice a week at the coffee shop. I want you to lead the marketing and positioning modules. Pay is minimal but you'd have direct access to 20 founders who all need exactly what you're offering. The opportunity was obvious enough that I agreed immediately, then spent the next 2 weeks developing curriculum that distilled everything I'd learned from my recent client work into teachable frameworks. The process forced me to articulate my methodology in ways I'd never had to do for corporate clients who'd mostly wanted execution rather than education. The bootcamp launched in early November with a cohort that ranged from a 19-year-old kid building agricultural sensors to a 50-something former professor commercializing research about water purification. Teaching them revealed patterns I hadn't fully recognized in my own consulting work, common mistakes and misconceptions that technical founders consistently made when trying to communicate about their innovations. One session focused entirely on value proposition development, and I watched the cohort struggle with the exercise I'd designed. They wanted to lead with features and specifications, with the technical elegance of their solutions rather than the practical problems they solved. Getting them to flip that script required persistent challenging of their assumptions about what potential customers cared about. During the break, a founder named James approached with unusual thoughtfulness in his expression. This framework you're teaching, he said. Have you considered productizing it? Like, building an actual platform or process that technical founders could access beyond just your personal consulting availability? The question echoed Imani's earlier challenge about scalability, but coming from a student in my cohort it carried different weight. What would that even look like? James shrugged. I don't know exactly. But you're essentially teaching us a repeatable methodology for translating technical innovation into customer-focused messaging. That seems like something that could be systematized, turned into templates and tools and maybe even software that guides people through your process. You'd be helping way more founders than you could ever serve personally, and you'd build a business instead of just trading your time for money. I thought about his suggestion constantly over the following days, simultaneously attracted to and intimidated by the ambition it implied. Building an actual product or platform meant investment of time and resources I didn't have, technical implementation I couldn't do myself, and market risk that went far beyond my current project-based consulting. It also represented exactly the kind of thinking that had drawn me to startup culture in the first place, the willingness to see a gap in the market and build something to fill it rather than simply accepting existing limitations. Priya noticed my distraction during our weekly check-in meeting at the grind station. You've got that look, she said, studying my face with analytical precision. The one that means you're working through something complicated. What's going on? I explained James's suggestion and my conflicted response to it, watching her process the information with the same systematic thinking she applied to her sustainability algorithms. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her coffee mug. So here's my perspective as someone who's building a product, she finally said. What you're describing is terrifying and probably has a 70% chance of failing completely. But the 30% chance of success is worth pursuing because you've identified a real need that nobody else is addressing effectively. Also, she added with a slight smile, you told me the same thing when I was hesitating about committing full-time to my platform. Something about how playing it safe was the riskiest strategy of all. Her words hung between us like a mirror reflecting my own advice back at me. You're right, I admitted. I'm being a hypocrite. Not a hypocrite, she corrected. Just human. It's easier to tell other people to take risks than to take them yourself. But I'll say what you said to me, if you don't build this, someone else eventually will, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you'd been brave enough to try. That weekend I sketched out initial concepts for what a productized version of my methodology might look like. Not software necessarily, at least not initially, but rather a structured program that combined education, templates, and personalized guidance to help technical founders develop effective marketing strategies. Something between pure consulting and a completely automated solution, leveraging my expertise in a way that didn't require my direct involvement in every client interaction. Imani reviewed my rough framework Sunday evening while eating takeout Thai food at her desk. Her feedback was characteristically direct and technically informed, pointing out implementation challenges I hadn't considered and suggesting approaches that would make the concept more scalable. You need a technical co-founder, she finally concluded. What you're describing requires some custom software, probably a platform that combines educational content with interactive tools. I could build it as a side project, but honestly you need someone full-time committed to the technical implementation while you focus on content and business development. The suggestion of finding a technical co-founder felt like a threshold I wasn't ready to cross, an acknowledgement that I was serious enough about this venture to bring on a partner with equity stakes and shared decision-making. It also meant moving beyond the safety of consulting work that generated immediate income toward building something that might take months or years to become profitable. Leonard Voss had different advice when I described my concept to him over coffee the following week. Don't overcomplicate the initial version, he said firmly. You're thinking about the eventual mature product instead of the minimum viable version that could start generating revenue in weeks rather than months. Launch with what you can do personally, even if it doesn't scale, and use that revenue and customer feedback to inform what you build next. His pragmatism cut through the grandiose planning I'd been engaging in, the tendency to design the perfect solution before validating whether anyone actually wanted what I was offering. What would a minimum viable version look like? Leonard leaned back in his chair, considering. You already have the curriculum from Claudia's bootcamp. Turn that into a structured online course that founders can take self-paced. Charge a few $100s per enrollment. Include some templates and frameworks they can apply immediately. Offer optional one-on-one coaching sessions as an upsell for people who want personalized guidance. Total development time, maybe 2 weeks if you're focused. Revenue potential, modest but immediate. The simplicity of his suggested approach was simultaneously appealing and disappointing. I'd been imagining something more substantial, a comprehensive platform that would establish me as a serious player in the founder education space. But his stripped-down version could actually launch quickly, generate income, and provide real market validation for whether my methodology had commercial value beyond my personal consulting. I spent the next 3 weeks building exactly what Leonard had suggested, turning my bootcamp curriculum into a structured online course with video lessons, downloadable templates, and practical exercises. Priya helped me set up the technical infrastructure for delivering the content and processing payments. Imani reviewed every module with an engineer's eye for clarity and logical flow. Claudia agreed to let me announce the course launch at her coffee shop during the next Founder Showcase. The course went live on a Tuesday in early December, priced at $347 because Priya had read somewhere that odd pricing converted better than round numbers. I announced it to my email list of approximately 200 people accumulated through my consulting work and networking efforts, then posted about it across my limited social media presence. The first sale came within an hour. Then another. By the end of the first day I'd sold 11 enrollments, generating more revenue from automated course sales than I typically made from a week of consulting work. The validation was immediate and intoxicating, proof that my expertise had commercial value beyond my personal service delivery. Priya texted me that evening with a simple message, "Told you people would pay for this. When are you hiring that technical co-founder Imani mentioned?" The question pushed me toward a decision I'd been avoiding. Building a real company meant commitment beyond what I'd been willing to consider, meant believing in this venture enough to bet significant time and resources on its potential. It also meant having difficult conversations with potential partners about vision and equity and long-term goals, negotiations that felt intimidating for someone whose previous decade had been spent subordinating her ambitions to support her husband's career. But sitting in Imani's apartment watching course enrollment numbers climb slowly but steadily, I felt something crystallize that had been forming since I'd stepped off that plane from Seattle. I wasn't running away anymore. I was building towards something specific, something that belonged entirely to me and reflected my values and capabilities in ways my previous career never had. I opened my laptop and started drafting a job posting for a technical co-founder, carefully articulating the vision for what I was building and the kind of partner I needed to make it real. The posting felt like a declaration of intent, a public acknowledgement that I was serious about transforming my consulting practice into an actual company with products and processes that could scale beyond my individual capacity. Before I could second-guess myself, I posted it to several founder-focused job boards and communities, then immediately worried I'd been too ambitious or not ambitious enough in how I described the opportunity. Imani glanced over from her desk where she was doing her own work, reading my anxiety and whatever my posture was telegraphing. "Stop spiraling," she said without looking up from her screen. "You built something people want to pay for. Now you're looking for help building more of it. That's literally how every successful company starts. You're doing fine." Her confidence steadied me enough to close my laptop and stop obsessively refreshing my email for responses. The posting was live. The course was generating sales. I'd made tangible progress from consultant to founder in less than 4 months. Whatever happened next would unfold on its own timeline, and my job was to keep building regardless of uncertainty or self-doubt. The following week brought my first serious inquiry about the technical co-founder position from someone named Adrian Park, who had back-end engineering experience at 2 previous startups and was looking for an early-stage opportunity where he could have significant impact. His email was thoughtful and specific, asking questions about my vision and technical requirements that suggested he'd actually read my posting carefully rather than mass applying to every founder opportunity he could find. We scheduled a video call for Friday afternoon, and I spent Wednesday and Thursday preparing for the conversation with the kind of intensity I'd once reserved for pitches to major corporate clients. This was different though, higher stakes, because I was selling someone on joining my venture as a partner rather than simply convincing them to hire me for defined work. I needed to articulate not just what I was building but why it mattered and why Adrian should bet his time and expertise on my vision. The call itself felt simultaneously terrifying and energizing. Adrian was 32, had been laid off from his previous startup when it failed to secure a series of funding, and was deliberately looking for something early stage where he could build from scratch rather than joining an established team. He'd taken my course immediately after seeing the job posting and had specific feedback about how the technical implementation could be improved and expanded. "What you've built is solid for a first version," he said, screen sharing to show me his notes. "But there's enormous opportunity to add interactive elements and personalization that would dramatically increase the value. Imagine if instead of static templates, the platform could dynamically generate customized marketing frameworks based on specific inputs about each founder's product and market." His enthusiasm was contagious, and we spent 90 minutes discussing possibilities that expanded far beyond my initial vision. By the end of the call I knew I wanted to work with him, but the question of terms remained uncomfortably unresolved. I'd never negotiated equity splits or co-founder agreements before, and the conversation felt weighted with implications I didn't fully understand. Leonard connected me with an attorney who specialized in startup formation, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel who'd seen hundreds of founder partnerships form and dissolve. Her advice was pragmatic and slightly cynical, focused on protecting both parties through clear documentation of roles, responsibilities, and equity vesting schedules. Most co-founder breakups happen because people don't have explicit conversations about expectations up front, she explained during our consultation. They assume they're aligned and then discover fundamental disagreements after they've already committed significant time. My job is to force those conversations now before you're legally and financially entangled. The framework she provided helped me structure a second conversation with Adrian where we discussed everything from work hours to decision-making authority to what would happen if one of us wanted to leave the venture. The discussion was uncomfortable in the way that important conversations always are, requiring me to articulate boundaries and expectations I'd never had to defend before. We ultimately agreed to a 60-40 equity split in my favor, reflecting that I'd initiated the venture and built the initial product, with vesting over 4 years and clear termination provisions if either of us failed to meet our commitments. Adrian would build the technical platform while I focused on content development, marketing, and business operations. We'd both draw minimal salaries initially, enough to survive but nowhere near what we could earn in traditional employment. The partnership agreement was signed on a Wednesday in mid-December, and we officially launched what we'd named Catalyst Labs with a mission to help technical founders master strategic communication. The name had emerged from a brainstorming session where we'd tested dozens of options before settling on something that suggested transformation and acceleration without being too cute or overly complex. My course sales had reached 43 enrollments by the time we signed the partnership papers, generating just over $14,000 in revenue after processing fees. It was simultaneously modest and miraculous, proof that the gap in the market I'd identified was real and that people would pay to access my methodology even in its rough initial form. Adrian immediately started building the enhanced platform we discussed, working from Imani's living room when I wasn't using the space and from coffee shops when I was. Christmas approached with a surreal quality, my first holiday season in years without Derek's family obligations and social commitments. Tessa flew down from Seattle for 3 days, ostensibly to visit but really to verify that I was actually okay rather than performing stability while privately falling apart. We spent her visit eating breakfast tacos, touring Austin's quirky neighborhoods, and having the kind of long conversations we'd rarely managed when my life had been structured around Derek's schedule. "You seem different," she said on her last evening, the two of us sitting on Imani's small balcony watching the sunset. "Not just happier, though you are definitely that. More like yourself, if that makes sense. Like you're finally inhabiting your actual personality instead of performing a version you think you should be." Her observation pierced something in me that had been carefully protected, a recognition of how thoroughly I'd contorted myself to fit Derek's expectations and the life we'd constructed together. The person I'd been in Seattle had been a careful performance, curated and controlled to project the right image to his colleagues and clients. Here in Austin, scrambling to build something from nothing with no safety net, I'd had neither the energy nor the inclination to perform anything other than my authentic striving, occasionally terrified but fundamentally determined self. After Tessa left, I received an unexpected email from Derek's attorney about the divorce proceedings. Apparently my lack of response to multiple previous communications had frustrated their timeline, and they were now threatening to pursue contested divorce proceedings if I didn't engage immediately with the asset division process. The email was professionally worded but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of irritation that I'd failed to prioritize their convenience. I forwarded the email to Rachel, the attorney who'd helped with my co-founder agreement, with a brief note asking if she could recommend someone who handled divorce matters. Her response came within hours, already on it. A colleague of mine specializes in Texas divorces where one party relocated from another state. She'll make their life complicated if they try to push you around. Forwarding her contact info now. The efficiency with which my new professional network mobilized to support me felt like a revelation compared to my previous existence where I'd been dependent on Derek for every significant decision. Here I had people who'd become genuine allies in just a few months, relationships built on mutual respect and shared values rather than social obligation or strategic networking. The year ended with Catalyst Labs having served 68 course enrollments and generating just over $23,000 in revenue. Adrian had built a functional beta version of our enhanced platform that incorporated interactive elements and personalization features. We'd begun accepting applications for our first formal cohort program, a 6-week intensive that would combine the course content with live group sessions and personalized coaching, priced at $2,500 per participant. On New Year's Eve I sat in Imani's apartment while she attended a party I declined to join, preferring quiet reflection to celebration. My phone contained exactly 0 messages from Derek, who'd apparently accepted that our marriage was definitively over and I wouldn't be returning to Seattle to simplify his divorce timeline. Instead I had messages from Priya sharing her year-end revenue numbers, from Leonard offering to introduce me to a potential investor, from Claudia asking when I wanted to schedule another bootcamp cohort at the coffee shop. 6 months ago I'd been standing in an Italian town with €80 and no plan beyond surviving the immediate crisis of abandonment. Now I was sitting in Austin with a growing business, a technical co-founder, and a professional identity that belonged entirely to me. The transformation felt both impossible and inevitable, as if I'd simply been waiting for catastrophe to permission me toward becoming who I'd always had the capacity to be. The first cohort of Catalyst Labs launched in mid-January with 12 participants, each one a technical founder struggling with the exact challenges I'd identified during my own consulting work. Adrian and I had spent the previous 2 weeks refining our curriculum and building out the interactive platform features that would differentiate our program from generic marketing courses. The price point of $2,500 per participant meant we were generating $30,000 in revenue from this single cohort, enough to cover our minimal salaries for several months while we reinvested everything else into platform development. Our kickoff session happened virtually, 12 faces appearing in gallery view as I introduced the program structure and learning objectives. The participants ranged from a woman in her 50s who'd spent decades in academic research before commercializing a medical device to a 24-year-old who dropped out of MIT to build machine learning tools for climate modeling. What unified them was technical brilliance paired with complete inability to articulate why anyone should care about their innovations. One participant named Dr. Helena Winters had developed a diagnostic tool that could detect certain cancers months earlier than existing methods, a genuinely revolutionary medical advancement. But when I asked her to explain her value proposition in 30 seconds, she immediately dove into technical specifications about sensitivity rates and biomarker identification. A potential patient hearing that pitch would have no idea why they should care or how this innovation might save their life. We spent the first 2 weeks of the program systematically dismantling their instinct to lead with technical features, forcing them through exercises that required identifying emotional drivers and practical outcomes before they could discuss implementation details. The resistance was predictable and sometimes fierce. These were people who'd spent years developing deep technical expertise, and suggesting they bury that expertise beneath simpler customer-focused messaging felt like asking them to hide their most valuable assets. Dr. Winters was particularly frustrated during our third session when I rejected her revised pitch for still being too technical. This isn't dumbing it down, I explained for what felt like the 100th time. This is meeting your audience where they are instead of requiring them to have a PhD to understand why your innovation matters. You can share the technical details later once you've earned their attention with a clear value proposition. She went quiet for a moment, then asked a question that cut to the heart of what I was teaching. So you're saying I need to make them care before I try to make them understand? Exactly. And the way you make them care is by connecting your innovation to problems they already know they have or outcomes they already want to achieve. Cancer diagnosis timing isn't meaningful to most people. But getting treatment early enough to dramatically improve survival rates, that's something every patient and family member cares about desperately. I watched something shift in her expression as the framework finally clicked into place. Over the following weeks she transformed her entire pitch structure, leading with human stories about early detection impact before introducing any technical specifications. By the program's midpoint her confidence had grown noticeably, and she'd started applying the methodology not just to her marketing materials but to investor conversations and partnership negotiations. The cohort's progress energized me in ways my previous consulting work never had. As a solo consultant I'd been limited to the handful of clients I could serve personally, but this model allowed me to impact multiple founders simultaneously while Adrian's platform work created tools that would eventually enable us to serve even more people with less direct involvement from me. The scalability Imani had challenged me to pursue was finally becoming tangible. February brought unexpected attention when a prominent startup podcast reached out asking to interview me about Catalyst Labs. The host, a former founder turned investor named Michael Torres, had heard about our program from one of his portfolio companies and was interested in discussing the gap in the market we were addressing. I almost declined the invitation, intimidated by the platform and uncertain whether I had anything valuable to say to his large audience. Claudia talked me into accepting during one of our regular coffee shop conversations. "You've built something people need," she said bluntly. "Hiding that under a bushel because you're nervous about visibility is stupid and self-sabotaging. Get on the podcast, tell your story, let people know this resource exists." The interview itself was scheduled for late February, giving me 2 weeks to prepare talking points and anticipate likely questions. Adrian helped me craft narratives about our methodology and platform features. Leonard coached me on how to discuss business metrics without overselling our early traction. Priya ran me through practice questions, pushing me to articulate the deeper why behind our work rather than just describing what we did. The actual recording was less terrifying than I'd anticipated once Michael put me at ease with his conversational interviewing style. We talked about my background in luxury brand marketing, the transition to startup consulting, and the patterns I'd identified in how technical founders struggled with strategic communication. He asked pointed questions about our business model and growth plans that forced me to articulate vision I hadn't fully formulated before. The episode aired 3 weeks later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours we received over 200 inquiries from founders interested in our program, investors wanting to discuss potential funding, and journalists asking for follow-up interviews. Our course sales spiked from the steady trickle of a few enrollments per week to dozens per day as people discovered us through the podcast audience. Adrian and I were completely unprepared for the surge in attention and demand. Our infrastructure barely handled the traffic spike. Our customer support consisted of me personally answering emails whenever I found time between other obligations. We had no sales process for handling the investor inquiries that suddenly flooded my inbox. The success we'd been working toward had arrived faster than we'd anticipated, and we were scrambling to build the operational capacity to sustain it. "We need help," Adrian said during an emergency planning session at the grind station. "Like, yesterday. We can't personally respond to every inquiry and still do the actual work of running programs and building platform features. We need to hire people." The conversation about hiring marked another threshold I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Bringing on employees meant payroll obligations and management responsibilities and the weight of other people depending on our venture for their livelihoods. It also meant acknowledging that Catalyst Labs had grown beyond a scrappy 2-person operation into something that needed actual organizational structure. Leonard connected us with a fractional COO named Patricia Chen who specialized in helping early-stage companies build operational foundations. She reviewed our business in a 2-hour consultation that felt like surgery, cutting through our ad hoc processes to identify critical gaps and inefficiencies. Her assessment was simultaneously devastating and clarifying. "You've built something valuable," she said without sugarcoating her observations. "But you're operating like hobbyists rather than business owners. No documented processes, no clear division of responsibilities, no financial projections beyond next month's expenses. The podcast gave you visibility, but visibility without operational capacity is just exposure to how unprepared you are." She left us with a roadmap of immediate priorities, hire a program manager to handle cohort logistics and participant support, implement customer relationship management software to track inquiries and conversions, develop financial models that projected revenue and expenses over 18 months, create documented processes for everything from enrollment to content delivery. The list was daunting but necessary, a wake-up call that our scrappy startup phase needed to evolve into something more sustainable. We made our first hire in early March, a woman named Jessica Palmer who'd been working in operations at a larger edtech company and was looking for an early-stage opportunity where she could have significant impact. Her experience bringing structure to chaotic environments proved immediately valuable as she systematized everything Adrian and I had been handling through improvisation and mutual understanding. With Jessica managing program logistics, Adrian and I could focus on our actual strengths, him building platform features, me developing content and business strategy. The division of labor increased our productivity dramatically, and within 2 weeks of her start date we'd cleared the backlog of customer support inquiries and established processes for handling new ones efficiently. The investor conversations that had been languishing in my inbox required different attention. Leonard helped me understand the landscape, explaining which types of investors would be appropriate for our stage and business model versus which were simply taking meetings without serious interest in funding companies like ours. He introduced me to several seed-stage funds that focused on edtech and founder-focused tools, coaching me through pitch preparation that felt distinctly different from the marketing work I'd been doing. Pitching investors meant selling them on our vision and growth potential rather than convincing customers to buy our current offerings. The shift in framing required me to think bigger than I'd been comfortable with, to articulate not just what Catalyst Labs was today but what it could become with proper capitalization. The exercise pushed me to confront my own ambitions, to acknowledge that I was building something I wanted to grow substantially rather than maintain as a lifestyle business that funded my comfortable existence. One fund in particular showed strong interest after my initial pitch. They were called Frontier Ventures, focused specifically on companies building tools and infrastructure for startup ecosystems. The partner I met with, a sharp woman named Aisha Okafor, had been following our progress since the podcast interview and had taken our course herself to evaluate our methodology firsthand. "What you've built has real defensibility," she said during our second meeting. "You're not just providing marketing services, you're teaching a systematic approach that technical founders can internalize and apply across their entire business strategy. That's valuable intellectual property, and the platform Adrian is building creates network effects as more people use it and contribute examples and templates." She outlined terms for a seed investment that would give us 18 months of runway to scale our team and platform without immediate revenue pressure. The amount was substantial enough to feel transformative, $750,000 in exchange for 15% equity. The terms included board observer rights for Aisha and quarterly reporting requirements that would impose discipline on our currently informal operations. Adrian and I discussed the offer extensively over the following week, weighing the benefits of capital against the loss of independence and increased accountability. We consulted with Leonard, with Rachel our attorney, with several founders who'd taken similar seed investments and could speak to the experience. The consensus was that Frontier's terms were fair and that Aisha's expertise in our market would be valuable beyond just the capital she was providing. We accepted the investment in late April, signing term sheets that committed us to growth targets and operational milestones that felt simultaneously exciting and terrifying. The money hit our bank account within 2 weeks, transforming our financial position from scrappy sustainability to actual runway for scaling. Our first priority was hiring additional team members to handle the demand we'd been struggling to meet. By mid-May we'd brought on 2 more program managers, a content developer to help me scale curriculum creation, and a part-time marketing coordinator to handle the social media and email marketing I'd been managing inconsistently around other priorities. Each hire changed the company's dynamics, adding capabilities but also complexity as we navigated the transition from everyone knowing everything to needing actual communication structures and documentation. Our second cohort launched with 24 participants at a slightly higher price point of $3,000 each, generating $72,000 in revenue. Course sales continued at a steady pace of 40 to 50 enrollments per month, and we'd begun piloting enterprise offerings where we'd work with venture capital firms or accelerators to provide our program to their entire portfolio or cohort of companies. The business model was diversifying beyond individual founder sales into larger institutional partnerships that promised more stable recurring revenue. The growth meant I was spending less time on the work that had drawn me to this venture in the first place, directly helping founders transform their strategic communication. More of my hours went to management, to investor updates, to strategic planning and hiring decisions. The shift was necessary but disorienting, requiring me to redefine my role as Catalyst Labs scaled beyond what Adrian and I could personally deliver. Derek resurfaced in late May with an email I almost deleted without reading. The subject line was simple, "Congratulations," and the message itself was brief. "I heard the podcast interview. What you've built is impressive. I'm sorry for underestimating you. The divorce was finalized last week. I hope you're genuinely happy." His acknowledgement of my success should have felt validating but instead felt empty, arriving too late and carrying too little weight to impact how I viewed either our failed marriage or my current trajectory. I'd stopped needing his approval months ago, had built something meaningful without his support or blessing. His belated recognition changed nothing about my circumstances or self-perception. I deleted his email without responding, then immediately felt petty for the impulse. Claudia noticed my mood when I stopped by the grind station that afternoon, her observational skills honed by years of watching people work through emotional challenges while caffeinated. "Ex-husband?" she guessed, sliding a courte-à-deux across the counter without asking what I wanted. "How did you know?" She smiled slightly. "You've got the expression of someone who just received validation they thought they wanted and discovered it doesn't actually matter anymore. It's a very specific face. Means you've genuinely moved on rather than just performing recovery." Her insight was characteristically accurate. I had moved on, not through some deliberate process of healing but through the simple reality of building a life so consuming and purposeful that Derek's existence had become irrelevant to my daily experience. The business I was growing, the team I was building, the founders I was helping, all of it mattered more than nursing grudges or seeking recognition from someone whose opinion no longer held power over my self-worth. June brought an unexpected opportunity when a major tech conference in Denver invited me to speak on a panel about strategic communication for technical founders. The invitation came through Aisha, who sat on the conference advisory board and had suggested me as a panelist. The platform was significant, thousands of attendees including founders, investors, and media who covered startup ecosystems nationally. I accepted despite immediate anxiety about speaking to such a large audience, recognizing the visibility as valuable for Catalyst Labs even as it pushed me far outside my comfort zone. The panel itself was scheduled for the conference's second day, positioned in a prime afternoon slot that suggested the organizers considered the topic central rather than peripheral to their program. Adrian encouraged me to treat the panel as a product launch opportunity, using the platform to announce new features we'd been building into our platform. Jessica helped me develop supporting materials and a post-panel strategy for converting interested attendees into customers. The preparation felt excessive for a 20-minute panel appearance, but their insistence on treating every visibility opportunity strategically was transforming how I thought about business development. The conference itself was overwhelming in scope, sprawling across multiple hotel venues with simultaneous tracks covering everything from fundraising strategy to technical architecture decisions. I attended other panels and keynotes when my schedule allowed, absorbing the energy of thousands of founders and operators all focused on building and scaling their ventures. The environment was intoxicating and exhausting, a concentrated dose of ambition and innovation that made Seattle's tech scene seem provincial by comparison. My panel took place in a ballroom that held roughly 300 people, and I was startled to find it nearly full when I arrived. The other panelists were established figures in startup education and founder support, people whose work I'd studied while building Catalyst Labs. Being positioned as their peer felt surreal, as if I'd accidentally wandered into a conversation several levels above my actual status. The moderator opened with a question about why technical founders struggled so consistently with strategic communication, and I found myself relaxing as the discussion hit topics I'd spent months thinking deeply about. My answer focused on the fundamental mismatch between how engineers were trained to think versus how effective marketing required thinking, about precision and accuracy versus emotional resonance and simplification. One of the other panelists, a former founder turned investor, challenged my premise. Aren't you suggesting that technical founders need to hide or diminish their expertise? That seems condescending, as if customers can't understand sophisticated innovation. The question carried an edge that suggested he viewed my methodology as insulting to both founders and customers, and I felt defensive irritation rise before consciously setting it aside. Not hide their expertise, I replied carefully. Translate it into language that connects features to outcomes people already care about. It's not about dumbing down, it's about meeting audiences where they are and earning the right to go deeper into technical details by first establishing why those details matter. The exchange sparked broader panel discussion about accessibility versus accuracy, about who had responsibility for bridging communication gaps between technical innovation and market understanding. I held my ground on the positions I developed through months of direct work with founders, pushing back against suggestions that customers should simply educate themselves to understand complex innovations rather than founders learning to communicate more effectively. After the panel concluded, a line of attendees formed wanting to discuss their specific communication challenges or learn more about Catalyst Labs. I handed out business cards and tried to have meaningful conversations despite the overwhelming number of people and my own exhaustion from the adrenaline of the panel itself. Several attendees mentioned they'd already taken our course or enrolled their teams, validation that our reach was extending beyond the Austin ecosystem where we'd built initial traction. One conversation stood out from the dozens I had that afternoon. A woman who introduced herself as Karen Liu explained she was Chief Marketing Officer at a growth-stage AI company that was struggling to articulate their value proposition despite having genuinely transformative technology. She wanted to bring me in to work directly with their founding team, describing a scope and budget that exceeded anything we'd done previously by an order of magnitude. We should talk more seriously about this, I said, trying to project professional composure despite internal excitement about the opportunity she was describing. I'm not sure we have capacity for the kind of intensive engagement you're outlining, but let me connect you with my team and we can explore what might be possible. Karen handed me her card with a knowing smile. Your hesitation is actually reassuring. Everyone else I've talked to immediately oversells their capacity and promises things they can't deliver. Call me when you get back to Austin and we'll discuss terms that work for both sides. The flight back to Austin gave me time to process the conference experience and its implications for Catalyst Labs' trajectory. We'd reached a point where opportunities exceeded our capacity to pursue them, where demand for our methodology was outpacing our ability to deliver it through current structures. The problem was one of abundance rather than scarcity, but it required strategic thinking about how to scale without sacrificing the quality and effectiveness that had generated initial success. Adrian met me at the airport with his laptop, too excited about new platform features to wait until I'd gotten home. He'd built an AI-assisted framework tool that could analyze a founder's initial description of their product and automatically generate suggestions for value proposition framing and customer messaging. The technology was rough but promising, pointing toward a future where our methodology could be delivered at scale through software rather than requiring intensive human guidance for every user. We tested his prototype during the drive back to my apartment, which I'd moved into the previous month after nearly 9 months living in Imani's spare room. The AI's suggestions were sometimes off-target but occasionally brilliant, identifying emotional hooks and practical applications that weren't obvious in the technical descriptions founders had provided. With refinement, the tool could dramatically increase the value of our self-serve course offerings while reducing the need for expensive personalized coaching. This could change everything, I said, watching the AI generate increasingly sophisticated suggestions as Adrian fed it more examples. If we can automate even 50% of what I currently do manually in coaching sessions, we could serve 10 times as many founders without hiring more program managers. Adrian nodded, his eyes on the road but his mind clearly still on the technology. That's the goal. Build tools that encode your expertise so founders can access it anytime without needing to book time with you specifically. You become the architect of the system rather than the bottleneck in delivering it. His vision articulated something I'd been struggling to define, the path from me personally serving clients to building something that could impact thousands of founders without requiring my direct involvement in every interaction. The transition required trusting that our methodology could be sufficiently systematized and that automated tools could deliver meaningful value even without human customization. The team gathered at our small office the following Monday to discuss conference outcomes and strategic priorities for the coming quarter. We'd outgrown working from coffee shops and had rented modest space in a shared workspace building, giving us dedicated area for team meetings and focused work. The office felt like a tangible marker of progress, physical space that represented our evolution from scrappy side project to actual operating company. Jessica presented data on course conversions and cohort satisfaction that showed consistently strong results. Our Net Promoter Scores from recent graduates averaged in the high 60s, indicating that participants were actively recommending our programs to other founders. Several cohort alumni had been featured in pitch competitions or successfully closed funding rounds after applying our methodology to their investor communications, giving us case studies that demonstrated tangible impact. The conversation shifted to how we should prioritize the opportunities in front of us. Karen's enterprise engagement, expanding our cohort capacity, building out the AI-assisted tools Adrian had prototyped, developing new course modules for advanced topics, pursuing additional speaking opportunities and media appearances. We had more potential directions than resources to pursue them all simultaneously, requiring strategic choices about what would generate the most value with our current team and capital. Aisha joined us for the second half of the meeting via video call, offering investor perspective on our prioritization decisions. Her guidance pushed us toward focusing on enterprise partnerships and platform development rather than expanding individual cohort capacity, arguing that those directions offered better scalability and defensibility than continuing to grow primarily through direct service delivery. "You've proven the methodology works," she said. "Now the question is how you build sustainable competitive advantages beyond Natalie's personal expertise." Enterprise partnerships create recurring revenue and deeper integration with your customers' operations. Platform development creates proprietary technology that competitors can't easily replicate. Those should be your focuses for the next 6 months. Her strategic clarity helped resolve our internal debate about prioritization, and we left the meeting with defined objectives and resource allocation across our core initiatives. I would focus on closing the enterprise deal with Karen's company and pursuing 2 other similar opportunities that had emerged from conference conversations. Adrian would lead platform development with support from 2 contractors we'd engaged for specific technical capabilities. Jessica and the program managers would maintain our current cohort schedule while beginning to develop the operational infrastructure needed for larger enterprise implementations. The pace of work intensified through June and into July as we executed on multiple fronts simultaneously. I spent hours on calls with Karen and her team, working through the scope and structure of what would become our largest engagement to date. Adrian pushed hard on the AI tool development, often working late into the evening to hit aggressive timelines we'd set for ourselves. The team began showing signs of strain as we balanced growth demands with the reality of still being a small organization without deep operational reserves. One evening in mid-July I found myself alone in our office after everyone else had left, staring at financial projections that showed our burn rate accelerating faster than our revenue growth. The seed funding that had seemed so substantial in April was depleting at an alarming pace as we invested in team expansion and platform development. We had roughly 9 months of runway remaining if our revenue didn't increase significantly, a timeline that felt simultaneously distant and terrifyingly close. My phone rang with a call from Tessa, who'd been following my progress from Seattle with supportive interest and occasional skepticism about my pace of expansion. Her first question after pleasantries was characteristically direct. "Are you actually happy? Or are you just running so fast you don't have time to think about whether this is what you want?" The question stopped me completely, forcing me to examine motivations I'd been too busy to interrogate. Was I building Catalyst Labs because it represented genuine purpose and fulfillment? Or was I simply fleeing from the failure of my marriage into work that provided external validation of my competence and worth? The distinction mattered enormously, determining whether my current path was sustainable or just another form of avoiding deeper questions about identity and meaning. "I think I'm actually happy," I finally answered. "Not in the sense that everything is easy or that I've figured everything out. But I'm building something that matters, helping people solve real problems, operating with autonomy I never had when my life was structured around Derek's career. That feels meaningful in ways that transcend whether the business ultimately succeeds financially." Tessa was quiet for a moment before responding. "That's good. Just make sure you're not sacrificing your entire life for the business the way you did for your marriage. Different structure, same pattern of losing yourself in someone else's needs, except now the someone else is a company instead of a husband." Her warning echoed in my mind after we disconnected, a necessary challenge to examine whether I was building sustainable success or simply trading one form of self-negation for another. The question would require ongoing attention as Catalyst Labs continued growing and demanding more of my time and energy. For now, though, I needed to focus on the immediate challenges in front of me, closing the enterprise deal, hitting platform development milestones, and ensuring we had enough runway to reach profitability before our seed funding ran out. The enterprise deal with Karen's company closed in early August, bringing in $250,000 in revenue over 6 months for a comprehensive strategic communication overhaul of their entire product portfolio. The contract represented a validation point that extended beyond the money itself, proof that our methodology had value at scale beyond individual founder education. Adrian and I celebrated quietly at the grind station, too exhausted from the negotiation process to manage anything more elaborate. September brought the kind of milestone I'd stopped allowing myself to imagine during those first desperate weeks in Austin. Our monthly recurring revenue crossed $100,000 for the first time, combining course sales, cohort enrollments, and enterprise contracts into a revenue stream that finally exceeded our burn rate. We were profitable on a monthly basis, no longer racing against our runway but actually building sustainable business operations. Vanessa Hartford's name appeared in my inbox that same week, attached to a LinkedIn message I almost deleted without reading. The woman Derek had left me for wanted to congratulate me on my success, having apparently followed my journey through industry publications and social media. Her message was professionally warm, carefully worded to avoid acknowledging the personal history between us while expressing admiration for what I'd built. I stared at the message for a long time before archiving it without response. Whatever she wanted from that contact, acknowledgement or absolution or networking connection, I had no interest in providing. She belonged to a chapter of my life that had definitively closed, and her attempt to insert herself into my present felt presumptuous in ways I didn't have energy to address. The team had grown to 12 people by October, requiring actual management structure and communication processes that felt increasingly corporate despite our startup culture. Jessica had evolved into a genuine chief operating officer, handling day-to-day operations while I focused on strategy and business development. Adrian led our growing technical team, now 4 engineers building increasingly sophisticated platform capabilities. We'd moved into larger office space, a converted loft in East Austin that finally provided room for everyone to work comfortably. A warm Thursday afternoon found me sitting across from Leonard at an outdoor cafe, discussing our plans for a Series A fundraise the following year. His guidance had been instrumental throughout my journey, and I'd asked him to join our board as an independent director when we formalized our governance structure. He'd accepted with characteristic pragmatism, warning that he'd be annoyingly direct about strategic missteps but committed to helping us scale successfully. "You've built something remarkable in 18 months, he said, reviewing the metrics I'd shared. From abandoned wife with no plan to founder of a company that's genuinely changing how technical innovation gets communicated to markets. That's not luck, that's competence and determination manifesting as business outcomes." His validation landed differently than Derek's belated congratulations had, carrying weight because it came from someone who'd watched me build everything from nothing and understood the specific challenges I'd navigated. I thanked him, then asked the question that had been weighing on me as we planned for larger scale. "Do you think I'm ready to run a company that's 10 times this size? Because that's where we're heading if the Series A goes as planned." Leonard considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "Nobody's ready for that until they do it and discover they either can or can't. But you've demonstrated adaptability and learning capacity, which matters more than having every answer in advance. You'll make mistakes at larger scale, everyone does. The question is whether you'll recognize and correct them quickly enough to survive the learning process." His honesty was bracing and reassuring, acknowledging that the path forward would involve continued struggle and uncertainty while expressing confidence in my fundamental capabilities. We spent the rest of our meeting discussing specific areas where I'd need to develop new skills or bring in experienced operators to complement my strengths. Derek appeared at our office unannounced on a gray November morning, looking uncomfortable and out of place in our casual workspace. Jessica intercepted him at reception, then came to my desk with an expression that mixed confusion and protective concern. "Your ex-husband is here asking to see you. Want me to tell him you're unavailable?" I considered the easy escape she was offering before deciding that final closure required actual conversation rather than continued avoidance. "Send him back," I said, clearing my desk of the strategic planning documents I'd been reviewing. He approached my desk hesitantly, taking in the office environment with obvious surprise at the scale of operation we'd built. The space hummed with productive energy, team members collaborating at workstations and in small conference rooms, physical evidence that Catalyst Labs was thriving rather than merely surviving. "This is impressive," he said, gesturing vaguely at our surroundings. "I didn't realize you'd grown this much." "What are you doing here, Derek?" The question came out more weary than hostile, and I realized I felt nothing toward him beyond mild curiosity about what had prompted this visit. He sat in the chair across from my desk without invitation, his posture suggesting this conversation would be difficult for him. I wanted to apologize properly, in person. What I did in Italy was cruel and cowardly. I've spent the past year realizing how thoroughly I underestimated you, how much I needed you to stay small so I could feel important. His confession should have felt satisfying but instead landed flat, an explanation that arrived too late to matter. "I appreciate the apology," I said carefully. "But I don't need it anymore. What happened between us is history that I've moved past." "I know," he said, and his expression carried something that looked like genuine regret. "That's actually what I'm here to acknowledge. You didn't just survive me abandoning you, you transformed it into something I could never have imagined you were capable of. I was wrong about your potential and about what you needed from life." We talked for another 20 minutes, an awkward but necessary conversation that allowed us both to close our shared chapter with actual acknowledgement rather than unresolved bitterness. He told me Vanessa had ended their relationship after 6 months, apparently recognizing patterns in Derek that I'd experienced during our marriage. He'd spent the past year in therapy working through control issues and fear of inadequacy that had manifested as needing to diminish the people closest to him. When he finally left, I returned to my strategic planning with a lightness I hadn't expected, as if his visit had removed weight I'd been carrying without fully recognizing its presence. The past was truly settled now, no longer capable of imposing itself on my present or future. Catalyst Labs crossed $1 million in annual recurring revenue in December, 18 months after I'd fled Seattle with 2 suitcases and no plan beyond immediate survival. We celebrated with the entire team at a restaurant downtown, toasting our collective achievement while already planning for the growth ahead. Adrian announced he'd been working on a surprise. Our AI-assisted framework tool was ready for beta testing, representing months of development that would finally allow our methodology to scale exponentially. The year ended with me sitting alone in my apartment, which I'd finally furnished with pieces I'd selected for myself rather than borrowed or inherited. My phone contained messages from the team, from Tessa, from founders whose careers had been transformed by our programs. No messages from Derek, who'd returned to his life in Seattle and would presumably remain there. I thought about the woman who'd stood in that Italian town with €80 and crushing uncertainty about her future. She believed she was being punished, abandoned as consequence of being too demanding or insufficiently supportive. Instead, she'd been inadvertently liberated, released from a life that required her constant diminishment to function properly. Sometimes cruelty creates unexpected gifts. Sometimes the worst thing that happens becomes the catalyst for discovering capabilities you never knew existed. Sometimes being left behind means finally being free to move forward on your own terms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.